Hello, and welcome to BI Basics 104, Why Business Intelligence Projects Fail and What You Can Do About It. I'm Craig Utley, and I have been in 40 to 50 companies looking at their BI solutions. Sometimes they've actually built a data warehouse and they're trying to deploy it. Other cases, they're still in the planning stages. But in all of these companies, they face certain challenges, and I've tried to take the most common challenges and distill them down to say, look, these are the things that tend to get in the way of a BI project. So what are those issues and what can you do hopefully to address those and get those roadblocks out of your way? Now obviously following these tips and techniques will not guarantee you success, but it should certainly help you overcome most of the challenges that you see occur very commonly in data warehousing and business intelligence projects. So the first thing to do is talk about the primary reasons for failure, and this is just an overview. I talk about each one of these in detail. But just a quick rundown, politics, that's a very challenging one and difficult to overcome. Inadequate user involvement, a mother of all data warehouses, overly complex cubes, IT people are really good at that, and I'll discuss that. Incorrect or inadequate KPIs, poor data quality, all companies have it, and it can sink a warehouse very quickly. I'll talk a little bit about the funding, and finally, limited or poor access to data, probably the single most common thing I see at companies. So let's jump right in and talk about politics. First of all, the problem. You tend to have a lot of turf battles when you're doing a BI project. This can be the resources involved in the project, who should be helping. Should it be the development group, the DBAs? What's the right mix of those people? What about outside of the IT organization? It becomes very interesting. Also, this affects the vision and focus of what the warehouse will be, or the mart really in most cases, since most people aren't building an enterprise-wide data warehouse at the very beginning. So you get these turf battles all the time, and one of the turf battles that you see often is people still claiming to own the data. This always amazes me. I was at a manufacturing company a few years ago, and they had the managers of each of the different manufacturing locations arguing that they owned their data and there was no way they were going to let it roll up to corporate. Well, these folks work for the company. The company owns that data. I don't care how hard these managers worked at these various locations. The data was corporate data, and being able to consolidate it and bring it together was going to allow the business to make better decisions. And I never quite understood that turf battle, but it does happen. So in some cases, you get people claiming they own the data and they feel threatened by this project that's coming up, and other times people who have been the report gopher, in a sense, the people that others in the organization come to for answers, they feel threatened by this because they're afraid they'll lose their monopoly on providing data to others. So what can you do when politics are a problem? Well, unfortunately, it's tough to say. Every circumstance is different. One is you might have to actually get in, roll up your sleeves, and play more politics. Personally, I don't like to play a lot of politics. I find it very tiresome and a waste of time. So I tend to take the other approach, which is less politics. I try to avoid that at all costs. And the easiest way to avoid the political problems is actually to just find a business champion, someone outside the IT organization. The higher level, the better. And usually this is the person that has the problem that you're trying to solve with the warehouse in the first place. So imagine if you can get the CFO of the company or the vice president of sales and marketing or whatever it is you want, and they say, I have this problem. That person can cut through a lot of red tape. When these problems pop up, they can just say, this is the way it's going to be, end of story, and people have to fall into line. So being able to find a champion like that to spearhead the project and really cut through any resistance is absolutely valuable. If you don't have that for whatever reason, then you'll have to become a political animal in some respects. You'll have to learn how to navigate those political waters. This one I mentioned first because it's common, but there's really sometimes not a whole lot you can do about it. The best thing is to find as high a level person as you can, solve their problem, and that gives you a very clear approach to what the solution should look like, and hopefully then it's much easier to get it through. So the next problem to talk about is inadequate user involvement. This is very common, and again, IT departments are really bad about this particular thing. They just say, oh, we need to build a data warehouse, and they don't talk to the business. They're not trying to solve a particular problem. It's just, we have all this data, we should consolidate it into a warehouse, and life will be better. Well, I have on the slide here that data warehousing or BI projects are not IT projects. Now, that may sound odd. It is IT that's doing all the work, so in that respect it's an IT project, but it's not something that IT necessarily should initiate and lead. This needs to be done in most cases by someone outside the IT organization. Again, as high a level person as you can find who will sponsor this project. But by having it outside the IT organization, you do a couple of things. Hopefully, you get user involvement earlier, and it's much more focused on actually providing a solution. One of the things that you don't want is to build the warehouse that then no one uses. And again, IT is really good at that. I'll talk about that in just a moment. Not having a user involved early or a group of users involved early enough, you have solutions that are too hard to use, they're completely over-engineered, and they don't actually solve any real-world problem. So the answer to this should be pretty simple. First of all, involve the users early. Got actual end users of this, the people you're targeting this solution for, and say, okay, how will you actually interact with this? How will you use it? And so forth. And having those users involved early and understanding what they need, you can teach them how to ask questions, and then as you start working on this, you can show them that you're making progress. Show them the data frequently. The more frequently you can show them, the better you'll know if you're on track or not. One of the things you don't want to do, of course, is to build a large warehouse, go through a very long process, only to have the users turn their nose up at it. It's true of any project, but certainly is a problem with data warehousing projects. One of the things that you'll want to do as well by having these users involved early is decide how you're going to deliver the data to them. Remember, different users have different needs. You've seen that in other videos. And also, as part of the user involvement, make sure you establish a training plan. A lot of companies never think about how they're going to train the end users to actually use this data. Now, when I say end users, of course, some end users may only see basically static reports. They don't have to actually manipulate the data. But whoever the analysts are, whoever the power users are, you need some way to explain to them this is how you get in and work with data in a warehouse. Okay, another problem is the mother of all data warehouses, and this is a bit of a religious debate sometimes. There are two camps basically in the data warehousing space. One is you should start by building individual data marts, one for finance and one for manufacturing and one for sales and one for human resources, and then over time you can roll these up, combine them into a single data warehouse that covers the entire organization. So that's kind of the bottom-up approach. The other approach is the top-down approach, where you build an entire enterprise-wide warehouse first, and then you break pieces of it off into data marts that get pushed out into those different organizational units. These are the two schools of thought, and there are certainly pros and cons to each approach. But again, in all these companies that I've been in, I have yet to see a successful implementation of the top-down approach. I've never seen a company start by designing an enterprise-wide warehouse at the start and building that and then breaking out marts later. So it's kind of it's called the boil the ocean approach. Rather than taking a small amount of water and boiling that, you're going to boil the entire ocean at once. The reason that I've never seen this work, there's several reasons, of course. One is that it just takes a very long time to do this. I saw one company attempt this, and after 10 or 11 months, I think they had a lot of documentation. They had nothing actually on the computer to show, no cubes, no ETL, nothing, and they were out of money at that point. They'd spent a couple $1,000,000 and they were done. So very expensive lesson for that organization, and it was unfortunate because they should have been receiving benefit very early on from this. Also, if you're building this enterprise-wide data warehouse, it's really hard to implement lessons learned because you're not learning those lessons as you go along. So you can't do a small piece, learn a lesson, and implement that in the next one. Instead, once you begin actual implementation, you've already designed the whole thing. So it's a lot harder to slide those lessons in. So of course the solution to this is real simple. Don't build that enterprise data warehouse to start. Start by building data marts. And again, there are people who will argue against this. I had a company that I spoke to that said, we want you to come in and help us design this enterprise-wide data warehouse at the start. We tried the data mart approach and it didn't work for us. Well, again, neither one of these is the right solution. But one of the challenges with the data mart is that you'll build one data mart, let's say, for the human resources. Of course, it will have an employee dimension and a time dimension. And then later you build a data mart for, let's say, the sales and marketing. Well, it of course has an employee dimension and a time dimension. You want those to be the same. That's called conformed dimensions. If the employee dimensions in those two cubes are different, it's much more challenging to ever tie them together and analyze data from both of them at once. So you really have to be careful, and that is one thing you do have to do up front as best you can, is design those dimensions that will be shared across multiple data marts. Now the methodology for an enterprise-wide warehouse or just a data mart is exactly the same. The only difference is scope, so it's the same process. And it's just much narrower, and you can get it out quickly, and users can see that you're making progress, and you can actually know, are you on track or not. So notice that I say that an initial project should take no longer than 3 months, and hopefully much shorter. I've actually seen data warehouses go from concept to being used in production in less than a month. Now these are small, obviously. The ETL is not very complicated at all, which is where you spend a lot of time, and they're not doing really complex analysis, but they are doing analysis with it, and they go into production and work. So you want to look at a quick hit win that you can get, because it does several things for you. It starts providing the business with benefits right away, and it shows that you know what you're doing, and you can hopefully achieve better funding or more funding for continued work on the warehouse. So it's good for the business. They start getting benefits right away. It's good for the project because it can continue and grow from there. Now the next thing to talk about are overly complex cubes. And actually cube complexity is one of the biggest problems that I see, and this is something that typically happens when IT builds the cube or set of cubes, and they do it without a lot of input from the business. And the problem is that IT people think differently than most people, and I don't mean that in a bad way at all, but if you throw a cube at an IT person that has, well, I'll just throw out a number, 20 dimensions, usually no problem. But some end users, that's too complex. It's hard to navigate. It's hard to use. They don't understand how it all fits together and how it works. So IT organizations tend to build these really complex cubes as far as the number of dimensions and the way that you have to analyze the data. And that does prevent users then from adopting these and using it. I've been in a number of companies, and this is not so true anymore with 2005, Analysis Services 2005, because of the way it handles dimensions. But with 2000, you had, you simply had these rigid dimensions. You didn't have the attribute dimensions, as you'll see in later videos. But I would go into companies and they would say, well, our cube has 30 dimensions. Well, that was a very large number and way too many for most non-technical end users to ever understand very well. I did some work for a company that bought data from stores around the country, store chains, grocery store type stuff, and they would consolidate this data from all these chains and put it into cubes and send out to people at the companies providing the goods, and these companies could then do analysis. You know, where are my products selling and where aren't they, and what our competitors' products look like, and so forth. Well, what was interesting about this is this company was making a lot of money sending these cubes back out to these companies, and those cubes had 4 dimensions in them. Very simple cubes, and yet very powerful and very worthwhile. So what's the solution to overly complex cubes? Well, first of all, understand that there are 2 types of cubes that you can build. I mean, this is a logical construct, nothing physical about these, but there are cubes that people will use for analysis, and there are cubes then that you can use for building reports. For building reports, it can be a very complex cube because these reports are typically being built by IT people or power users who can navigate these and understand it. But for people who are doing some hardcore analysis on this, they typically need a simpler cube structure to that. Now, you can achieve some of that today in Analysis Services 2005 using what are called perspectives, kind of like simplified views on the world. Or you can actually build separate physical cubes. So I mentioned in here to use as few dimensions as possible in an analysis cube, because that just makes it easier for users to manipulate, to work with, to analyze, and gain knowledge. Notice I mentioned a good rule of thumb is a maximum of 8 dimensions. Now again, in Analysis Services 2005, every attribute can be treated as a dimension. But assume for a moment that I'm talking about, for example, a time dimension. It may have 1 or more hierarchies built in it, a product dimension, a customer dimension. I'm talking about things at that high level. And I can talk more about then how do you handle this explosion of dimensions with all these attributes later. That's coming up in future videos. But the goal here is just to keep this simple. Now, in Analysis Services 2000, you could actually build several separate cubes and then link them together. Theoretically, you can still do that, although you don't have to with Analysis Services 2005. There, you can use those perspectives I talked about earlier to create just some simplified views of these very complex cubes, and that's what users can interact with. It's actually a fairly useful concept when we talk about this. Now, the next problem I want to discuss is the problem with having incorrect or inadequate KPIs. KPIs, again, key performance indicators. They're like measures, but they're a little bit more powerful. But for now, just assume kind of the metrics or the measures in the cube. And so whether a cube is simple or really complex, it may not actually contain valuable information. Again, a problem when IT organizations don't involve the end users. IT organizations typically just roll up whatever data they have. They might say, oh look, we have sales, and they throw that in there. Is sales important? Absolutely. But what if a company is really more concerned about retention of customers? Well, you can obviously identify that from sales, but if you don't put any kind of customer retention metric in the cube, it's not nearly as useful. So not having the proper KPIs means that it's just not as useful to the business, and they're not going to use it. So you may implement this, put it into production, but if no one uses it, there's really no point in what you've done. So what's the Okay, sorry, I had to correct a typo there. What's the solution to incorrect or inadequate KPIs? Obviously involve the business early. And again, outside of IT, get business users involved. Have a champion. That is very important as well. And one of the easiest things to do, and it sounds a little hokey, but one of the easiest things to do is find out what metrics upper management has their bonus based on. If you think about that, if the vice president of manufacturing, say, has a certain set of metrics that his or her bonus is based on, And that's what they're going to want to monitor on a daily basis or hourly or whatever. They're going to want that in a scorecard. They're going to want an easy way to see that. So having that as part of the warehouse makes the warehouse very valuable to that person. So find out what KPIs people get bonused on. Find out what it is that the business is actually focused on reducing. For example, might be interested in reducing headcount turnover or just employee turnover. So, what are those metrics, and therefore that's what you want to build into the cube. And then again, deliver this in some easy-to-use fashion, scorecard being the typical example there. Now, one of the biggest problems when it comes to doing data warehousing is data quality. And I don't think there is an easier way to discover bad data than to try to build a warehouse. In fact, a customer of mine very recently had an organizational structure. You had managers at a certain level, and then you had basically area managers, and then below that you had more localized managers, and then you had the actual salespeople. Well, that sounded great until they started finding places where salespeople reported directly to area managers, bypassing that middle layer of managers, and yet that wasn't supposed to be possible. So was it bad data, or were there cases where they were violating the principles or violating the way the organization was supposed to work? Well, they didn't know. They had to go in and investigate this. So that data had been in the system that way for potentially years, but no one had ever really realized it. So, these are the kinds of things that you'll find all the time. I worked with an organization based in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And for those of you not familiar with it, Ann Arbor is two words, ANN space and then ARBOR, Ann Arbor, Michigan. Well, they had a data entry system where the city name was free form. You could just type anything in there you wanted. And they had 14 different spellings of Ann Arbor. Now, these are people who lived and worked in Ann Arbor who should have known how to spell it, but sometimes it would be one word run together. Sometimes Ann would have an E on the end of it. Sometimes Arbor would have a U in the middle of it. It just very interesting in how that worked. So you have this bad data all the time in any organization, and fixing it in the ETL process before it gets in the warehouse is good because your warehouse is supposed to be consistent. But when you do that, you're not actually stopping new bad data from getting into the system. You really want to try to stop it at the source. So the solution is twofold. One is to try to fix the source systems to prevent bad data from getting into the system in the first place. In the case of that Ann Arbor situation, I've suggested that they change their client application so that rather than typing in the city, you could just pick it from a list. Of course, they thought that was crazy talk, but it made perfect sense to me, and that's typically the kind of thing you want to do. And you can point to the warehouse and say, look, it's causing a lot of extra work, a lot of headaches. There's data in here that's not always right. You need to fix the source system. And so that's one good way to drive fixes like that. Another thing to do is to create unknown buckets so that when you get bad data in, you just throw it in this unknown category and they can immediately see it. In some cases, it's not worth fixing bad data. For example, if you have 0.1% of your data as bad and it's going to cost $20 million to fix it, most companies would say, forget it. We don't care. That's just not enough to worry about. So there might be some acceptable level of bad data. In other organizations, they say, absolutely can't be any bad data. It has to be exact to the penny. And you find that a lot with financial applications. Also, I think in a lot of organizations it helps to identify people who own the warehouse or different parts of the data. I worked for an organization where they ran weekly updates on their warehouse. They did this over the weekend. And literally the CFO would come in on Monday mornings and he would run a series of reports out of the GL system and look at the data in the warehouse and make sure it all matched up. Now you can automate some of that, but in this case he did it manually, and no one used the warehouse that Monday until he sent out an email that it was okay. And that way, if there had been any failures, he could send out an email and say, don't use it, we've got a problem, and they'd reprocess on that Monday. And try to fix the problem and then reprocess the cube. And if you're not familiar with the term process, don't worry about that. We'll get into that later. But having people that own the data and can say that it is accurate so people have confidence in it can be an important step towards avoiding this poor quality. All right, one of the problems is inadequate funding. Even though you want to start small and you want a quick hit win, so it should be short, very narrowly focused, it still takes money to do this. And one of the problems is that people sometimes fail to fund every aspect. They say, oh, we already have servers, we don't need any new hardware, we don't need any new software, just bring somebody in, throw the data together, and then let's look at it. But when that happens, then it makes it very tough to grow. There's nothing to grow onto. The other thing is that most companies do this and then they can't maintain it. So they didn't make any allowances for training internal folks and having any kind of knowledge transfer and so forth. In addition, data cleanup always takes longer than expected. So someone can estimate, oh, from March 1st through April 15th, we're going to do our ETL and data cleanup and so forth. Well, but again, I've mentioned before in other videos, ETL is typically the vast majority of the effort on a project, and it's almost impossible to just say, oh, this is when it's going to start and stop. There are always new things that go on, and you have to get into it and work with it. So what's the solution here? Well, first, of course, is obtain sponsorship from the business. Again, have that high-level executive, and hopefully someone who can approve funding, because you need that in order to keep the project moving forward. It helps them to plan out the hardware and software that's needed, as well as the training. The hardware plan should look at what the warehouse is going to grow to over 1 year or 2 years or 3 years, whatever time horizon you need, but then what is all the hardware necessary for that. And then once you start establishing this plan, you should look at, okay, here is the business problem I'm starting with. When should I be able to deliver that? And then the next business problem. And again, you're not looking at, oh, I built this warehouse, isn't it great? It's, when can I attack this particular problem? When can I attack this particular problem? And let these sponsors know roughly when these things should be coming out. Now, again, I mentioned this before, this is probably the single most common problem I see, and it just blows my mind. And that is that a company will build a warehouse. It may have been done totally by IT, so it may be really complex. They may have done it the right way, whatever. They build a warehouse, and then they say, but no one uses it. And inevitably, when I go into companies like that, I say, okay, how are you delivering the data to customers? And they'll mention one product. It's usually Excel, but they'll just mention one thing. Well, that's how we deliver. Well, again, people need to see data in different ways. Different types of users need scorecards versus need analytics tools, what have you. So there's no one tool to deliver data from a warehouse. It has to be a suite of tools, a holistic approach depending on the types of access to this data that people need. And most people in the past always just used Excel, and I don't mean to bash Excel in any way, but Excel was not one of the better tools for getting to data warehousing data. It technically worked, absolutely it worked, but it wasn't a good way to do it. Now, I've had to add a little bullet to this slide because Excel 2007 is actually pretty good. I'm impressed with the improvements. And Office 14, which will become Excel whatever, 2009 or 2010 or what have you, should be even better. But 2007 is pretty good. But again, it's only one tool. It's really kind of aimed more at the analyst role, someone who can do ad hoc type queries. And so it's not as good for static reports or scorecards and so forth. So the solution to this should seem pretty simple. Look for the right tool for the users. Different types of users. Some need scorecards, some need analytics, some need reporting, some you just want to embed BI right into their application and they don't even know it's BI. So different types of tools for different types of users, and you'll expect to have a mix of all of these, or well, some or all of these, in an organization that has a BI solution. And if you don't understand going in up front the ways people are going to analyze this data, you better figure it out, because it's going to affect your cube design, it's going to affect your deployment plans. It's really critical to understand how they're going to use it. And that's why in an earlier video I started off with, here's the end result of a warehouse. Look at all the ways you can deliver data from a warehouse. Just showing you all the different tools all hitting the same cube. So in summary, data warehouses and BI projects, they fail for a lot of reasons, and a lot of those are really non-technical. Politics, certainly, funding is not a technical problem. So some of these are non-technical, some are technical, and data warehousing projects do have a large failure rate. So it's important to try to reduce or mitigate those risks as best as possible. Another failure area is poor design decisions, and I mentioned these here. Cubes are either too complex, or someone tries to build the mother of all data warehouses. Those are potentially somewhat related, but again, even a narrowly focused cube can be way too complex as far as the dimensions and any calculations built into it and so forth. One of the biggest challenges in any warehousing application is data quality. Absolutely a guaranteed situation in any organization. They're going to have bad data. So just be prepared for it and know that you'll spend a lot of time in your ETL cleaning up bad data. And never forget that the whole idea of a BI solution is to get the data out and not just in. So many IT organizations focus on, let's build the ETL, let's build the cubes, and so they take the data from all these other places, do all the manipulation and get it into a cube, and they never stop to think about how are the users going to get it out. They're just like, oh, we'll just give them Excel at the end. Well, again, find out who the users are and how they need to work with the data. So that wraps up why BI projects fail and what you can do about it. Thank you.